Welcome to Unfixed. This podcast explores the intersection of artificial intelligence and the institution of higher education. I am Zach Justice, Professor of Communication Studies and Director of Faculty Development.
And I'm Nick Janos, Professor of Sociology.
We are employees of Chico State, and we will discuss some of our work, but this podcast is not affiliated with Chico State, and the views expressed here are not representative of the university.
Hi, so we have a special episode today. While this podcast is focused on AI's impact on the institution of higher education. But of course, all of our students were once K through 12 students. This makes the line from kindergarten to college so important, though one that feels so disconnected. AI is making its mark on every grade and every level of education. But the siloed nature of education means we aren't always talking to each other across the pipeline. Today, we're talking with Stephanie Dinnen and Pete Seiner from the Teach Smarter podcast about how generative AI is reshaping K through 12 education and its connection to higher education. We'll spend less time on AI and assignments and more time on institutional and pedagogical aspects of these changes. Stephanie, Pete, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure to be here.
Cool. All right. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and how Teach Smarter came to be?
Go ahead, Pete.
All right. So I've been in education for about 10 years now. I started off as a teacher and then kind of moved into some of the curriculum implementation and professional learning. And throughout that experience, I think what I found was that when I started in education, I realized now how naive I was about the rapidness in which things change. And I remember right from the beginning trying to work with teachers and them saying like, all right, bud, like this is going to go away in a year. And I'd go home and be like, geez, these people are so frustrating. And then what I realized was that they were all 100% accurate and that everything does change so quickly that once people feel like they've gotten their feet in, you know, or they've gotten like some kind of comfort level with whatever it is they're doing, it gets changed. And so I think Teach Smarter came out of that general idea that particularly AI, I see so much value in it, and I can also see how teachers might interpret it as the next, big thing that's going to go away. And I think what we've come to realize is that it's not going anywhere. And so Teach Smarter is kind of a way to help teachers use AI and use it alongside tools that they're already using every day and not give them a whole plethora of new subscriptions and logins and tools. And so we want to, really just do what we can to try to bridge that gap.
My journey into education was a little bit more backwards. I was a psychiatric researcher for almost a decade, and my particular field of study was implementation science. So I kind of studied how evidence-based treatments make their way through really large organizations, how they get changed, where fidelity is kept, what are the sort of organizational constructs that make for successful implementation versus really failed implementation. And then for various family reasons, I stepped out of that career path and stepped into teaching. And very similar to what Pete said, I felt like I was constantly hitting my head against a wall with all of the new initiatives that were being installed and then occasionally implemented and almost never sustained. And so I really started to shift from classroom practice into coaching and then into administrative roles and now really into more of a consultancy role, helping schools to sort of bridge that translational gap between what we know about how practices are implemented and sustained and changed over time so that we stop having the exact same frustrating conversation that Pete was talking about over and over and over again.
Thank you so much. That's a great transition to our next question, which is, what have you learned about generative AI in education from doing the podcast?
Man, that's a loaded question. I think for myself, I just, you realize that I mean, this is going to sound like such a vague answer, I think, but there's so much potential to it. And just when you start to think you have a good grasp on, the best ways to use it and the best prompts to use, someone comes out with another idea that just is kind of like, man, I didn't even think about using it that way. And I think because we're all learning as we go, it's so, there is so much learning in that process. And, even with Nick, I mean, I think we learned a ton just talking to him about the higher ed kind of side of things. And last week we spoke to someone and they were talking about how they use prompting around, they'll prompt AI to talk about a student from, I think she said like 2050 and how she used that to kind of like backwards design her lessons to ensure her students are prepared for the future. And so I don't know, I think for myself, like I said, it's just, there's so many ways to use it. And I think we are really just still discovering those kind of possibilities. It's like, you don't know what you don't know. And so every time we find a new little niche, it's like, wow, it's really cool to explore the different ways to use it.
I'll just piggyback on that to say, as someone who was a really, really committed educator and who worked very hard and considered myself to be a really exceptional practitioner of my craft, what I appreciate about this moment right now is that it's very, kind of, as Pete was saying, it's very humbling, right? No one is good at this stuff right now. And I feel like if we just say that up front and start from there, then there is a chance that we can all get measurably better together. So I do feel like there's a lot of people running around right now that's feeling like very used car salesman-y. But we are all so new and at the beginning of this, and it is changing so rapidly. So it is fun to be a novice again.
Yeah, that's a good point. Definitely feel that way. So, Zach and I are been writing about and doing this podcast on higher education and the crossover and the impact of AI. And when I was on your podcast, we touched briefly actually on sort of AI and K through 12, and we wanted to have you on to talk about that. So let's go a little bit deeper on that topic today. So from your vantage point, working in the K through 12 space, how do you think, or what are the unique challenges posed by AI for teachers, for administrators that our listeners could, who are mostly going to probably be higher ed focused people? What should they know about the K through 12 space?
I think the biggest thing to be aware of, and boy, do I wish that our two sides talked more. I feel like there is a firewall. No one knows how it got there, but we never seem to cross-pollinate, even though it would seem like it'd be in the best, because our students are your students, soon to come. But I think the greatest challenge that K-12 educators experience, and I think it's almost impossible for anyone who is not a K-12 educator to really appreciate the scope of this, is that the average K-12 educator has 55 mandated initiatives in 11 different subjects and, 160 students on their caseload with different intensive, unique academic, social, behavioral needs. And so I think our K-12 teachers are at a point of capacity that is really inhibiting our ability, even though I believe that the desire is very broadly there, it's really inhibiting our ability to innovate and onboard and move with AI in the way that I feel like I see my post-secondary colleagues, doing and taking like large, hopeful, gainful strides.
I think, the first thing that came to mind was just time. But I think it's directly related to what Stephanie was saying. I think it's some of the time factor and not having the time to even kind of dig into this, even though, it would actually save time in the long run. It's like, it's hard to invest the time right from the beginning. I think there's also an element of trust that's lacking. I mean, again, like Stephanie said, with all the different initiatives and curriculums and the snake oil salesmen that we know run rampant through education, I think this, in so many ways, AI presents itself as the next solution to all of the problems that people have ever faced in humanity. And so I think people are jaded by the continued, we, again, kind of relating all back to what we've said, it's like people are I think already at a wall with like, here's another thing that everyone's promising me is going to fix everything. I think there's also an element of trust in AI itself. So not even just the notion that it's helpful, but not knowing if it's what's right for students and not knowing if students are using it the correct way. So it's probably a variety of things, but I would say time and trust are probably the two bigger things that came to mind.
That was a really interesting set of answers, and it cues up something that Nick and I talk about a lot, which is that we talk, especially us in higher ed, talk about K-12 as if it's one thing. But obviously we're looking at people from 5 years old to 18 years old, and it would be really helpful to disaggregate that in terms of what challenges exist for people in different clusters and how those might evolve over time as a student progresses from a child to a young adult. So how does that shift along the way, or do you all put those folks in different buckets in terms of age ranges and how we should think about them with the technology? And Nick, I think you mentioned this on an earlier podcast.
Well, I think you could talk a little bit about, from the student perspective, but then also, I was listening to your Teach Smarter podcast episode 16, which was all about lesson plans and the intersection of AI. So maybe you could also think about it. Tell us a little bit about this question from the different buckets in terms of the teachers themselves.
Well, if you'll let me nerd out a moment, because I don't get to talk implementation science anywhere near as much as I would like, right? We know from decades of research going all the way back to the 1960s in Everett Rogers that wholesale implementation, full force, all corners at once, sort of like the spray and pray model, is very, very labor intensive, extremely antagonistic, and not especially successful in complex, large organizations. What works so much more effectively is a stepped approach where we do one grade level in year one, and then that grade level and the one preceding it or the one following it in year two. And we build that momentum over time. It gives us time to course correct. We build in our own experts that way, right? Now we have internal experts, internal ambassadors who can reach out to the next grade. We in education, because, we service the most vulnerable, precious, our future, we are often told we cannot possibly wait, right? And of course, no teacher, no parent wants the children in their class or their child to be the one that's told, not yours this year, like 3 years, next year, 5 years, as we get down the pike. It's got to be everybody, K-12, all at once, all at the same time. And it should surprise no one when that often results in a lot of unnecessary failure. If I had my druthers, what we would be doing with AI right now in our planning would be starting with our seniors and working backwards. I'll die on the hill that our kindergartners will be okay without AI for a little longer, but our seniors will not be. And then we work back from our juniors. And so, as Pete mentioned, we had an excellent conversation with another very thought-provoking educator about futures literacy. And I think if we took a backwards model and worked from the top back down in K-12 with AI, we might actually get different outcomes than we have had in the past with the many other magic wand initiatives that have kind of come through. Pete, I wonder what you think about that idea. I've never even said that to you before.
Well, listen, if you're stamping your name on it, I'm behind it.
You're going to co-sign.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I agree with you on that. I think, it's interesting because the people who are making the decisions about how we kind of distill this out to students are people who already have the context of like the pre-AI world and the current AI, landscape, I guess. And so I think the challenging part is like we all see the benefit in how AI many of us see the benefit in how AI can help students and how it can be used to collaborate and all these great things. But at the same time, students aren't just they're not born with the innate, ability to distinguish which opportunities or which learning experiences they should really be taking the time to figure out on their own versus use AI for. And so I agree with Stephanie. Like, I really think that students will not only be okay without AI in kindergarten, but I actually see there being potential pitfalls with using it that early, because in those early stages, I think it's so important that students learn how to critically think on their own and, get frustrated when they're working on a problem and learn how to kind of just learn how to think, learn how to learn. And so, I think as they progress, like you said, K-12 is often like this one bucketed thing, but I think K to maybe 5 even is kind of still learning what school's all about. I would say middle school is generally in that same kind of weird transition, socially awkward period. But then when you do get to high school, you have kids who have learned how to think and be critical. And so I think that is the best time to kind of introduce this as more of the collaboration part. So I almost see it as like elementary through middle school, AI being mostly reserved as a teacher tool. And then kind of in high school, that's when you start to say, hey, maybe students can use this a bit to actually collaborate, because they actually know what collaboration means at that point. A 10-year-old doesn't know what the hell you're talking about when you say go collaborate with your computer. That's just going to be typing in a question and getting the answer. And I'm not saying they're not capable of it, but I would say wide scale, unless there's like super, super explicit, like implementation of this as a tool, and all the expectations are incredibly well thought out and the teachers are experts on AI. I just don't see it going in a really positive direction as far as developing that critical thinking.
I am just spiraling over here trying to think about what kindergarten AI education would look like. You're like doing B is for bat, and then, okay, class, now we're going to transition to the benefits of running LLMs on device for data security, and then you're like showing them examples of data breaches. I'm really spiraling trying to think about an appropriate use case over here.
Yeah, I also, it makes me think though about the appropriate age thing, because, and I sympathize with how hard these decisions are for K through 12 educators, because if you want those teenagers to use it appropriately and use it well, you can't really have it as the forbidden fruit for too long, because but also they will find it themselves anyways. But it also just seems like, well, where I heard about this thing that my parents are using, my teachers are using to do all their work. How come I can't use that? And that seems like a real potential problem there.
I think I more so think it's important for there to be lots of teacher input during that age. So I don't necessarily mean that it should be the forbidden fruit or totally banned. I just don't know that it's an appropriate tool to put in, to put the students as the pilot of in those grade levels, especially like an unfiltered version. So things like Conmigo or some of the AI that helps students with their differentiated pathways, I think those things make sense. But again, that's a heavily back-end teacher-driven experience versus a student that, again, like handing a first grader ChatGPT, I think is probably not an appropriate decision. Whereas obviously there are some educational tools that use AI. So again, I think it's more of like a filter thing with the AI and not so much a no AI ever. Because I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's not realistic.
And that made me think about, that, like I mentioned earlier on your podcast, episode 16, the title was What AI Lessons Plans Are Getting Wrong. And it was kind of a critical look at perhaps the uncritical use of these systems and tools to design educational material and lesson plans for students. So if we were to think about it from looking at the teacher perspective, what are some of the areas that there needs to be some growth and sort of learning in that realm about how teachers should be using these?
I think you raise another big juxtaposition between post-secondary and pre-K-12, which is I would hedge my bets that most of the professors at your respective colleges or universities have been either there or they have been professors for a while, and that is really their dedicated and chosen career, right?
Yeah.
It's like the old ivory tower myth. You're going to get there, you're going to get tenure,
you're
going
a lifer,
to stay
basically.
until you die. Yes. This is not the case for the workforce in K-12 education.
Mm-hmm.
The average teacher, right, nationally has been on the job for less than 3 years. That's how high turnover is. So not only do we need to think very critically about the developmental span of our students, but we have incredible variation in the professional experience within our workforce. So as Pete was saying, these things can be done really well when you have an expert teacher in the room. But our reality in K-12 education, because of turnover, is that the average classroom does not have an expert educator in the room. And so providing, like Pete said, an unfiltered tool, even just to the teacher, forget even giving it to the students now, where they are relying on AI to design curriculum with no independent ability to check the reliability or validity or cultural appropriateness of that curriculum. And we'll be frank, I think it's probably very similar for you. You know, your principal might have 80 teachers in the building that they're responsible for. You close your door, right? That is your little fiefdom. That's your little kingdom. Whatever's going on in there is what's going on. And so there aren't a great deal of checks and balances, particularly for our new teachers or our teachers who are instructionally weak or weak with technology. So we have to as well think very critically about the different striations that we're educating of educators in their use of AI.
Thanks. All right, well, let's transition to our third and last segment here. We wanted to circle back to something we talked about when I was on your podcast, but something you mentioned earlier in this episode around, for lack of a better analogy, the K-12 to college pipeline. It sounds so industrial. But basically, you know, and this is for, you know, American, in the American context, you know, that is traditionally and historically a very important move, going from graduating from high school and going to college. But as we alluded to, there's been a sort of firewall for so long, you know, that kind of, and that relationship is tenuous and informally structured, and complaints, I'm sure, on both sides. So here comes AI. How does, you know, generative AI sort of complicate that already messy relationship between K through 12 and higher ed from your perspective?
I know I think about my secondary teachers, and I have a high schooler myself. And I think about how much I wish that my secondary teachers and my son's secondary teachers had access to post-secondary professionals to say, hey, what do they need to leave here with in order, you know, regarding AI, in order to be successful with you? Because I think, again, we get very siloed. We close our doors, we teach, and we can very easily lose sight of the bigger picture. You know, you can teach second grade your whole life and not have a clue what the curriculum is in first or third grade. That's kind of how it works. Similarly, it seems to me from the outside that higher education is changing markedly, particularly higher education that works in a hybrid or virtual model. And so I think that our high school teachers in particular would benefit so much from just being able to sit down with your side and say, what do they need now?
Yeah, I mean, I would also say it's probably going to be a bit startling for students who, I mean, this is maybe not directly answering your question, but I think it's definitely a line. I mean, I think if students aren't prepared, especially with things like AI, and I mean, the other thing is, it's no longer where you have to access AI through ChatGPT or through Claude or something. Like, now that it's built into so many things, and you have, you know, like the generative text when you're texting or writing an email or researching. I mean, anything. The stakes are really low in high school and in K-12 in regards to the use of AI, and so I think something that's going to be maybe a concern is when students go from K-12 to the higher ed levels, the use of AI, if it's interpreted as plagiarism, like the consequences of that are so much greater than, you know, a 0 and a write home to mom. You know, things like being expelled from college and those kinds of things. So, you know, it just got me thinking that there's more on the line than just a teacher who doesn't trust it, doesn't want to use it, because actually this is the future for students. And so, I mean, it's becoming more and more important to make that the expectations of higher ed more transparent to students. And I don't know that it ever really is or was. And like even in my role with working with just K to 12, I constantly hear people tell their students like, "Oh, you're not going to get away with that next year when you're in middle school." And then I see so many of these middle school classes where I'm like, "Damn, it was way harder in 5th grade for those kids. This class is so easy." You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I think there's a transparency issue between the two.
That made me think about real quick. I'm not as familiar with the coordinating. I'm more familiar with how education is coordinated at the university level, which goes back to the power and role of faculty to control their curriculum. And I know, there's curriculum standards at the state levels. And then each school, like there's a whole stack here, right? And so what you're kind of describing is where teachers are on their own to kind of figure out their own policies, their own ways they're implementing it. They're developing, ethical standards, for their students. And then eventually, saying, hey, when you're in the next grade, they're not going to, act the way I act. Or, well, hey, when you graduate, high school, be prepared for those college professors. Just real quick, like just from a structural perspective, where could some of these changes, both whether it's in the development of curriculum or in developing the ethics around AI, how does that get sorted out in the K through 12 system?
Well, I think something to clarify is even though people take it upon themselves to create their own structures and implementation plans and all those kinds of things, it doesn't mean that that's what the district has in mind. And I think that's another huge gap is the district has these initiatives and they want you to follow the curriculum with fidelity, and they have, it is very structured in many school districts. But then because teachers have a lack of time, lack of planning, a lack of collaboration with their peers, they're almost forced to kind of just figure it out. And so, some of these schools, their idea of a kind of like a introduction to their initiatives or curriculums is the 3 hours they get in the beginning of the school year during orientation, or like the mandatory common planning times that end up getting hijacked for school fire drill information. So I think teachers need more time. They need more opportunities to plan. If there's initiatives that are put in front of them that they're expected to do, there needs to be the investment to actually make sure they feel prepared and confident with that approach. And I think that AI is no different. If we're going to be saying, hey, we purchased school AI or Magic School, or we get these pro plans or whatever, you have to invest the time to make sure people know what the hell they're doing. Otherwise, they're just flailing again with another tool. But now the stakes are, again, a little bit higher, because for the people who are given these tools, but then, like Stephanie was saying earlier, they might be brand new to teaching. They may not know what they're checking for in the validity of what they're getting. You could be implementing these whole different curriculums and whole different, false concepts to students and not even know that you're doing so. Yeah, people just need more time. They need more time to plan.
Thanks, Pete. I appreciate that so much. And it so resonates with something that Nick and I have noticed with the AI rollouts in higher ed, where some campuses do things really thoughtfully. There's lots of forewarning, there's lots of training, that kind of stuff. And then in some campuses that we've heard from, everyone on campus just gets an email one day that says, you all have ChatGPT accounts. You're welcome. And, the gap between those things is just incredible and potentially really destructive for student learning. I did want to tap back into this, not necessarily like the pipeline idea, but some of these transitions and ask you all to peer into the future. Something that Nick and I have noticed is the nature of work and instruction has evolved so much in the last couple of years. And part of it is because we're having students that next year, they'll finish their education with us, that they've had access to generative AI the whole time. If you can fast forward into the future, 5 years, 10 years, there'll be students coming to the university that have had access to these tools for the bulk of their K-12 education. And as Stephanie pointed out earlier, some districts are going to have a really forward-thinking, we're all implementing thoughtful integration, give teachers time to do stuff like Pete was saying. for some places it's going to be really haphazard.
Mm-hmm.
We realize it's not going to be steady, but what do we need to know about those students that are going to be walking in our doors in 5 years, having had 6, 7, 8 years of access to generative AI?
All right, guys. Well, it's great talking to you all.
Good luck. Good luck with that one. We wish you the best. Yeah. Run. No. I think it actually ties back to your previous question and to Pete's response really well, which is that something that you'll find a lot in pre-K-12 education, is that if you look at a district or even a state, it is a system of schools, not a school system. And that's a huge difference. And I think that actually one of the most productive possible outcomes of AI in the big picture scenario for pre-K-12, because of its pattern recognition abilities, is helping us to move closer to being a school system where it is integrated both horizontally and vertically within a school, K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but then also between schools, so that we don't deliver to you guys in 5, 6, 7 years students who have had incredibly inequitable experiences of AI literacy and of futures literacy. And I think that is one of my most significant concerns right now, is that I see us repeating our past bad habits with things like foundational mathematics and foundational literacy. And I have heard many a college professor lament that the kids we send to you now can't read, can't write, and I'm concerned that if we follow the same patterns of practice that we have in the past, that what we may deliver to you are a group of students who have had incredibly diverse and potentially very inequitable opportunities to learn with AI.
The irony is that the teachers who are the most resistant to tech, and they think they're almost like protecting students and helping to reinforce critical thinking so that when they do get to you guys, they're well equipped with these skills. Those are the people who probably need the most training around AI, because they're going to be the ones who are most at risk of not only getting left behind, but being taken advantage of from students. If they don't know what AI is, if they don't know what it's doing for students, it's going to be impossible for them to detect it and actually support students in an efficient way or an effective way. So, I mean, yeah, I don't have an answer for that question. I think Stephanie answered it well, but there's so much up in the air, and I think it's going to take probably some sort of, I don't know, oh God, I don't even want to say it, but like state intervention of some kind of, like, again, we have to invest the time into people if we're going to expect them to have any kind of consistent impact on students with this. It's no longer a thing that we can say, well, I don't like Google tools, so I'm just not going to use it. AI is everywhere. It's impacting the way students think or don't think. It's the way it's impacting what they produce and how they answer questions. And I definitely have the same worries as Stephanie, that when they do get to you and but then again, maybe I'm doing the same thing that that middle school teacher does to the fifth grader. When you get to college, you're really screwed, but maybe they're not. I don't know. Maybe it's just equipping them with more tools to get the work done.
Yeah, it's not easy stuff. I mean, basically, they don't really need to come knowing how to write a paper at this point, right? It's like those things. This is small stuff that we just had taken for granted. There's so many of those up and down the connection between the K through 12 skills and what they're going to need in college. But, you guys have state mandates, or K through 12 does. We don't.
Yeah, right.
I think that's a bigger risk for universities. I'm sure we'll still be educating kids in some capacity for a long time to come. But as they get older and older, towards 18, 19, 20, those ages, it's not as clear from our perspective.
But see, that's such an interesting point, though, what you said about like the papers, because I'm sure I have some professors in mind still that I like wake up in the middle of the night thinking about the papers I had to write for them. But at the same token, like, I don't know that we ever communicate with higher ed about what the actual expectations are. It's all these vague, it's again, going back to the middle school fifth grade thing, it's all these vague concepts of what you guys actually expect. And so it's like, if you're sitting there saying that's not really what we're looking for, then why are we still pretending that it is, Students need this. They need to be able to do this. What is that even rooted in at this point?
Yeah, Pete, this is a recurring theme for something that Nick and I have talked about, which is sometimes what AI does in education is reveal something that was already broken. And I think what you're highlighting is something that we've all sort of seen and felt for a long time, which is the lack of clarity between the educational bodies at different stages leads to misunderstanding. I mean, Nick and I have conversations with colleagues all the time, and they complain about the preparedness of students, but it's vibes, right? It's not, oh, they aren't meeting this particular standard. It's
That's a good way.
They don't know how to write.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, okay, well, what does that mean? And this seems to be another area where AI has uncovered something that we were already not very good at and just made it a little bit more clear for us.
I saw a quote the other day that said, AI won't fix education, but it might force us to.
Oh, that's so good.
That's good.
Yeah.
All right. You all have been really generous with your time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Where can listeners connect with you and find your work?
So they can find us on our website at teachsmarteredu.com, and they can also find the podcast, Teach Smarter AI in Education. I'll make sure I get you guys those links too.
Yeah, and we will post those in the show notes.
Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider subscribing on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. You can find our writing on meltsintoair.org and connect with us on Blue Sky at meltsintoair.bsky.social and on LinkedIn, Zach Justice and Nick Janos. Find these links and more in the show notes. If you have feedback or want to share an idea, email us at unfixed@meltsintoair.org. Thank you to Jamie Gunderson for producing and editing the show.